right, everybody. Welcome to Seattle. I am in the second portion of Road Trip 2021. So the first portion being over, almost 6,000 miles, east coast of America. Now I'm on the second portion, done almost 2,000 miles, and I am on the west coast of America. I guess west, this is the official symbol for West Coast America. In Seattle, as I mentioned, oddly enough, it's raining. Who would have thunk it? But here we are. Okay, a complete change up here today in the formatting of the YouTube channel because I'm trying to combine two things. I'm doing a little bit of an experiment. Let me lay the groundwork here. Let me give you a little backstory. For those of you who don't know, I have a website called Shifter, S-H-I-F-T-E-R, and it's shifter.media, not shifter.com. So let me repeat that, shifter.media. I've had this site for a long time. It came about for a variety of reasons, mostly had to do with my work and the fact that I was creating a version and volume of content that was hard to keep up with for a lot of people, including some of the folks I was working with. And they said it would be great for us if you had a site where you could just house this and we could cherry pick what we want. And that was one of the reasons why Shifter came about. One of the tabs on Shifter is called Dispatches. Dispatches, the name, is a nod to the book about Vietnam by Michael called Dispatches, which was one of the books about Vietnam that I think was a signature defining book about the war in Vietnam. It's a very classic book. Many of you have probably already read it. That's why the title of my series is called Dispatches. And my dispatches were long form audio interviews with creatives. And I've done about 70 of these, 7-0. And I took a break when COVID hit because it was really impossible to do these safely, but then also began to kickstart them over the last couple of months. So what I'm doing is I'm going to give the intro that I'm giving right now, and then I'm going to play you 10 minutes of an audio interview with visual artist Elena Dorfman. And then I'm going to come back and end this film, and I'm going to link out to the full interview, which is on my site, which is hosted on SoundCloud. I know that might seem a lot of confusing things happening here, but I have a sinking suspicion this is going to be a big part of my future, is going to be continuing to do these audio podcasts. And there's a variety of reasons why I do audio instead of video, and we can get into that at some point if you want. But there's three things that I want to remind you about before we listen to this and before I come back. Number one, Elena is the artist that I traveled to Albania with in 2019 to take her workshop. I had not taken a workshop in 20 years, and I knew that she had been traveling in and out of Albania since the early 90s when the country opened up. And I knew that if I went on this trip, I would be given an opportunity to educate myself, really focus on photography for 10 days, which I hadn't done in years, and really just try to get outside my comfort zone a little bit, which I did. The class was great. During that period, as I was designing a magazine in real time during the time that I was in Albania, Elena said, hey, we should think about doing this together. Let's teach the photography component together, and let's add the real-time bookmaking component as well, and that will be our workshop for 2020, which of course didn't happen because of COVID. We tried it again in 2021, and we just postponed it until 2022. Such is life during COVID, no big deal, we'll get there. So we pitched this, Albania workshop, everything was looking good. In the interim, because we can't go to Albania right now, we pitched a different class to the Santa Fe workshops. And I'm gonna link to all these things below. I'm gonna link to the Albania workshop, I'm gonna link to the Santa Fe workshops, and I'll just link to whatever else, my Shifter site, my SoundCloud site, all of those things that are important in this film. The Santa Fe workshops is either the first or second largest workshop series in America, Main Media being the other. I live in Santa Fe. I took my first workshop at the Santa Fe workshops in 1997 or 98. I took another one in 99. Those workshops changed my life and career, as they have for many, many other people. So seeing as I'm in contact with the Santa Fe workshops, I actually, with Elena, pitched an online class, which is not the same as our Albania workshop. It's a different subject. We're pitching it right now, and I think it's a class that might appeal to quite a few of you. And let me explain what the general concept is right now. Elena and I both came from what I would call classic linear photography narrative ideals, right? I studied photojournalism. She worked as a newspaper photographer, a reportage photographer. Over the years, that industry and those avenues have changed dramatically, to say the least. And also over that time, Elena really evolved as a photographer, and she was able to move successfully from genre to genre in photography in a way that is not common at all. And she's had success in each of these different evolutions. Again, not common, not easy, but I feel that it's almost mandatory as a photographer that you are able to do this now. I certainly did not do that. My heart and soul is long-form reportage photography, but I also realized that I was running out of avenues and venues for that work, and I had to figure out a way to take that narrative story or that narrative message and adapt it into the modern culture. And the way that I did that was through making atypical books, making atypical prints, making atypical blends of fact and fiction in the field. And in essence, what I'm talking about is conceptual art or conceptual image making, and blending that with a classic narrative. So that is the class that we have pitched to Santa Fe, which is about blending the fact and the fiction and having alternative methods of telling stories with deriving from traditional classic narrative photography. This is going to be an online class. It's going to be 2 parts. It's going to be very short, digestible, and fun, and you're going to learn a ton in a really short amount of time and see a bunch of great samples. All right, so let me check my notes. I'm almost done here, I promise. Okay, the interview that you're going to listen to is almost an hour long, but what we're going to do here on the video side is I'm going to play a 10-minute excerpt that's going to give you a sample of what this film is about. And at 10 minutes, it's going to fade out and it's going to leave you wanting more, because I ended it at a point where Elena is starting to talk about something that I wanted to listen to again. I have to say this before we end. I've done, like I said, 70 interviews. This is one of the best interviews I've done. To listen to what she's done and how she's done it, I cannot stress to you enough the privilege that it is for us to get this information. A lot of people are closed off, walled off, would never want to share anything or for any reason. And the insight that she's giving you on how she's been able to navigate her career, but also some of the other challenges that she's been through in her life, where she went to school, all of these other things, this is like an audio masterclass. So if you like the 10 minutes, go to the link and listen to the full interview on my site, and I will be back to wrap this up. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to what I was going to call my Dispatch interview series, but this is actually not a continuation of my Dispatch interview series. This is actually the first in a new series, and I'm here today with photographer, visual artist, Elena Dorfman. Elena, how are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks, Dan.
That was kind of fake. She's been around for a while. We've been talking nonstop, but I had to do that for the interview to make it sound official. But so we're going to cover a lot of different things here. I want to talk a little bit about your background, and then a little description of your work, some of the kinds of ways that you work, a little description of who you are, what you're up to, what you've done, and then we're going to get to the questions. And then I'm going to ask you a lot about some of the things that I mentioned here in the front, because I'm intrigued, and oddly enough, we've known each other for quite some time, and there's some basic componentry of your life and career that I don't know. How is that possible?
I don't know how it's possible.
We had so many other things to talk about.
Yes.
And we are going to get to a couple of things towards the end of this, the contribution to AG23, and also Albania, which is interesting because we now have a little connection via Albania of sorts, which we'll go into in detail. But you come from the Boston area.
I do.
Is it in Marblehead?
Marblehead, exactly.
Yeah.
Marblehead.
Okay. Yes, we've had much enjoyment over the past few days talking about the Boston culture and how unique it is. You went to Sarah Lawrence College.
Yep.
And I don't know much about Sarah Lawrence College. I chose my school based on the quality of the football team, University of Texas.
Yes.
So what was Sarah Lawrence? How was that?
Well, you chose football. I recall so vividly driving up into the driveway of Sarah Lawrence and seeing a guy with a shaved head wearing a dress, and I thought, this is my place.
Yeah.
That's how I got to Sarah Lawrence.
Okay, that's all it takes. We'll touch back on that in a minute. Your work covers a lot of different things, and this is something we're going to talk about in a minute about career evolution. But your work covers marginalized communities and neglected landscapes, and kind of dances between tensions existing between things like fantasy and reality and the artificial and the natural in a very unique way. Your photography style and content is pretty unique. I don't really know anyone else who's making work like you make, which we'll get obviously more in detail to. You're a photographer and a filmmaker, and you also work with tapestry, which is very interesting. I've seen a few of those over the past year or so.
And you're in private collections, public collections, you've got gallery representation, you've got at least 5 monographs and series out from Valbona Sublime, LA River, Empire Falling, The Pleasure Park, Fandomania, Characters and Cosplay, and Still Lovers, which is the project that was the first project of yours that I really saw in depth, and it's fantastic. And we're going to talk a lot more about that. And okay, let's just, we'll break into the questions here, which is, the first one is about, when I was doing a little bit of research on you, I realized that I would have probably called you a visual artist as opposed to a straight photographer. Would you agree with that?
I would call myself a visual artist now, but I definitely began as a straight photographer. In fact, really a straight photographer. I was a documentary photographer when I started, and it's evolved. You know, I'm considered a mid-career artist now, so I've had 6, 7, 8 series that have been conceived of and executed, and so that's taken some time. So my work has evolved over the last 2 decades. But I certainly started out I would say even as a photojournalist, for sure. And the work has evolved significantly since then.
So when you came out of Sarah Lawrence and you were a photographer, what did you envision your career would be? What did it look like to you at that point?
I went into newspapers right away. So I started, actually that's not true. So taking a step back, I was really a child of divorce. And so my father was a big film and photography buff. He sort of knew a lot about it, took a lot of pictures, made films. He was really interested. And so needing something to do with me as a divorced parent, he gave me a camera. And that's what we would do. We would go all over the Boston area photographing, and he gave me an old Rolleiflex. And so I started out shooting 2.25 with him. He built me a darkroom. So from a very young age, that's what I did, and that was our connection. And I really never thought I would do anything else, and I actually have never done anything else except carried a camera for pleasure and for my living.
How old were you when he gave you the camera?
Probably 10.
And do you remember some of the pictures that you made during that time?
Oh, they were just, we would go his shoes or my sister or my bedroom or, just whatever was in my immediate surroundings, probably. Although we traveled, and I would always take the camera. So and he taught me the darkroom really early.
That's fantastic.
Yeah. So it was really never a question of what else I would do. And so after Sarah Lawrence, a quick blip in between. When I was a young adult, actually still in high school, I was diagnosed with cancer. So I went through a couple of years of pretty serious cancer treatment.
Okay.
And what was lacking at the time was anybody telling the story of what young adults going through cancer was like. So when I got to Sarah Lawrence, it's a very open curriculum, and I asked my photography professor at the time, could I do a project on my own experiences with cancer, but focus on other young adults and their families, in order to give people an idea of what people, what young adults go through.
Yep.
And so I started it at Sarah Lawrence. It was called The C Word.
Yep.
Excuse me. And I finished it when I was about 26. I actually moved across the country in the middle of it. So I started in Boston, did some of it in New York, and then moved to California. And I actually never left California. So I finished the book when I was 25 or 26, and the book did, really well. People, hospitals, doctors, clinicians, people wanted to know what a 16, 17, 18-year-old with cancer, what they needed. And so,
I'm sure. I mean, a regular 16, 17, 18-year-old without cancer is a difficult problem to solve. We're all enigmas at that age. And so I'm sure for them it was an unbelievable resource to have somebody catalog all of that for them. Yeah,
I followed 5 teenagers, so 5 kids and their families from Boston to San Francisco, and kind of points in between. And spent a lot of time with them in real, true documentary fashion. I mean, I was with them for some of them a couple of years, going through everything they went through, living with their families, living with them in the hospital room. I was kind of reliving my own experience, but through them. And the book did, it did really well. I went on the lecture circuit. Many books were, second and third publications and printings. It was
And that was
surprising.
your first time putting a book together?
Yes,
and
that was
working
my
with a
first
publisher.
time. Exactly.
And how did that come about? Was that something that you pursued, or did they come to you? Because that in itself is a relatively monumental undertaking to do that. And then you now have the responsibility that you're photographing these other families, and this is going into print. And once it goes into print, it's out there forever.
Right. So how, if I recall correctly, how it happened was the book was finished. It took about 5 years.
Okay.
And I had 5 or 6 kids, and the sign-off from everybody, because we had all grown very close. And I was approached, I think, by a very small publisher in Oregon called New Sage Press. And New Sage had a publicity person who reached out all over the country.
Wow.
And she reached out to a man he and his family are extremely well known in the music industry. And they had recently lost their daughter, who was about my age. And they reached out to me and said, we want to know you, and we would like to help you get the word out. So they got me a literary agent. So
Okay.
I spoke all over the country about it, and they helped promote the book.
And how old were you when you were doing this?
26 or 7.
Wow. That's quite a first project.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it was really successful. And it was mostly important to me because I felt like I had given back to a community that was really important to me. And I had also been able to work out some of my own issues and thoughts and feelings about, having just survived a pretty difficult cancer treatment.
Yeah. Yeah, that's quite a way to enter into the photography world. And was that book that was prior to Sarah Lawrence or just after?
That was just after. I started it my last year of Sarah Lawrence, and then I moved to California, finished it there, and then the Chronicle did a big piece on the book, on me, and then they said, would you like to shoot for us? And that was actually those were my first assignments for the San Francisco Chronicle, because you know how things go. The director of photography, Scott Summerdorf at the time, had also lost his sister at a young age to leukemia. And he said, I really like what you've done. I like your work. Would you like to do a couple of assignments? And so that's when I started really actually being paid to take pictures for them.
That was your first foothold, was Chronicle San Francisco
Yes.
after moving across.
Yes.
That's a pretty good place to land as well.
Yeah, it was great.
What time frame is this? What year?
Oh, about 1990.
Because 90 was...
92,
Okay.
93, sorry.
92, 93 was prior to the digital revolution.
Yes.
And prior to the digital revolution was a very different lifestyle as a photographer.
Yes, it was.
I would say that those were the final years before both the positive and sort of negative turnover of the industry began to change immediately. And so here you get a degree from Sarah Lawrence, you do the cancer project in the book, and you're now working at the Chronicle, and you're doing reportage. You're basically doing
Yes.
newspaper assignments,
Yes.
which are pretty strict in terms of how you have to, ethically, when you're making pictures like that. It's not like you're doing it every day as you're shooting a feature project. You're shooting
Right.
very, very specific assignments.
Yeah.
And so you're still at the point where you are doing what you thought you would do as a photographer, in the sense that you're a straight photographer in your documentary.
Absolutely.
But you're also, are you starting to do projects on the side outside of because it's almost like you tasted the promised land by doing a long-term project that was self-started, and you got it published. I mean, it was sort of, from a terrible scenario, it was the best possible scenario in some twisted way.
Yep.
And so now you have a newspaper job, but are you...
Okay, that was a decent 10 minutes. Am I right or am I not right? I'm always right. That's what I tell my wife anyway. Always right, just know that up front and everything will be totally fine. So I hope that was an interesting little investigation into the audio side of my life and the kind of interviews that I do. I wouldn't even call them interviews. They're hour-long conversations. I don't edit, I don't script. We basically talk as if two photographers are sitting together or visual artists are sitting together talking about the way things are. I do this all the time in my personal life. I do this all the time in my professional life. And I wanted to start sharing a little bit of that with the greater audience, because so many of you have reached out and asked things that if you don't have a classic education in photography or the industry, then I can understand why you're trying to find some of this data, and it's very hard to find. So I hope that was helpful, and if you like this, just somehow let me know. Don't hit the like button or subscribe or do any of that stuff. Just send me a message or make a comment or something and saying, hey, this was cool, where can I find more of these, or whatever. It needs to be longer. I want 2 hours of audio interview. I don't know. Just let me know, man. It's my channel. I can do whatever I want.